In 1797, a Philadelphia physician named Benjamin Smith Barton wrote down a single sentence that had been told to him. The sentence was this: "When the ancestors of the Cherokee came into these lands, the lands were already occupied." Barton was not a fringe writer. He was a physician, he taught at the university, he sat in the American Philosophical Society, and he moved in the same intellectual circle as Thomas Jefferson. What was strange was not that he recorded a people who came before. That part was already known. What was strange was how he described them, and Barton had no way of knowing that those few lines asked the same question as a dry stacked stone wall standing on a mountaintop in northern Georgia, 885 feet of it, running along the summit. Nobody had measured it. Fort Mountain rises at the western edge of the Cohutta Range in northern Georgia, its summit standing near 2,850 feet, looking down on the valleys that were once the heart of Cherokee country. What gives the mountain its name is not the view but the structure along the top of it. The wall is built from local stone with no mortar, no lime, no binding agent of any kind. The stones are stacked, and that is all. It runs east to west for 885 feet, zigzagging along the ridge, and in places it survives today as nothing more than a low line of rubble, barely above the knee. Early accounts say it once stood considerably higher. 29 shallow pits are counted along its length, and at certain points there are gaps that look like gateways. And here the structure stops being an ordinary archaeological question. As a military fortification, the wall is badly placed. It does not fully enclose the summit, and at several points an attacking party could simply walk around it, which is the one thing a defensive line is not permitted to allow. As a hunting structure, it is absurdly oversized, because nobody hauls thousands of stones up a mountain to funnel a herd. It has no obvious beginning and no obvious end. There is no water on the summit, no trace of settlement, no flat ground for planting, which means whoever built it carried every stone up and then went back down to live. It encloses nothing. It defends nothing. And after more than a century of study, no one can say with certainty who built it. The Cherokee had an answer. It was not the answer anyone expected. The book Barton published in 1797 was titled New Views of the Origin of the Tribes and Nations of America. It was printed in Philadelphia, and it sat inside the serious scientific literature of its day. This is not a treasure hunter's pamphlet. It is not a newspaper curiosity column either. Inside that book, Barton relays an account given to him by a man named Colonel Leonard Marbury, who had dealt with the Cherokee directly. According to Marbury, the Cherokee said that when their ancestors first came into this country, they found it already inhabited, and that the people living there could not see during the day. Barton set the name down in translation, the Moon-Eyed People. And according to the account, the Cherokee eventually drove them out of the country. Note the date, 1797. Modern archaeology did not exist. Radiocarbon dating did not exist. Not one scientific paper had been written about the stone structures on Georgia's summits, and there was no mysterious wall for anyone to argue about. 13 years later, a second document appeared. In 1810, John Sevier, a Revolutionary War officer and the first governor of Tennessee, wrote a letter describing a conversation he said he had held years earlier with the aging Cherokee leader Oconostota. According to Sevier's account, the leader told him that the ancient fortifications in the region had been built by a people who lived there long before the Cherokee, and that those people were driven from the land after a series of wars. Then, at the close of the century, the record was institutionalized. In 1900, the Bureau of American Ethnology published James Mooney's Myths of the Cherokee, printed as part of the Bureau's 19th annual report. Mooney had spent years among the eastern Cherokee in North Carolina, collecting accounts directly from the people who told them, often in their own language. The Moon-Eyed record stands there too, inside the official annual report of a federal agency, without a single mention of a Welsh prince. 3 separate records, in 1797, in 1810, and in 1900, independent of one another, all carrying the same core: someone was here before us, and they are gone. None of these records went looking for the wall. Barton was not staring at a mountaintop, he was writing about languages and peoples. Sevier was writing a letter. Mooney was compiling ethnography. Not one of them was trying to explain a structure, and that is precisely why their statements are not shaped to explain one. Now back to the stone, because the stone has a problem of its own. Dating a stone wall is one of the hardest jobs in archaeology, because radiocarbon measures organic material, and stone is not organic. The wall itself cannot answer. Only the organic material underneath it or inside it can. A field notebook put it plainly in 1938. Along the line the wall was built on, there was nothing to excavate, only stone, and bedrock under the stone. That note was the only result the survey team came down with. In Tennessee they were able to do better. At Old Stone Fort near Manchester, a comparable hilltop enclosure, samples taken from associated deposits were radiocarbon dated, and the result came back at roughly AD 30 to AD 430, close to 2,000 years. No such sample could be taken at Fort Mountain. There is no layer beneath the wall to dig, because the structure sits directly on bedrock and the thin summit soil washed away centuries ago. What remains is regional context and comparison, and that context places the wall in the Woodland period, somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 years ago. If that estimate is right, only one conclusion follows. The wall was there before the historic Cherokee presence. And for decades the state of Georgia said so on its own sign. The official marker at Fort Mountain State Park stated plainly that no one knows who built the wall, and it listed the moon-eyed account among the possible explanations. Generations of visitors climbed the mountain and read, on a state sign, that nobody knows. Now to the second record, and it matters that we do not misunderstand how this one works. Oral tradition is not a fallback used where writing is absent. It is a record system with its own rules, its own carriers, and its own obligation to accuracy. Among the Cherokee, particular accounts are carried by particular people, transmitted under particular conditions, and are not altered at will. A detail inside an account stays where it is, the way a line stays on a page. And the communities carrying this tradition are not a thing of the past. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians lives today in western North Carolina, and the Cherokee Nation and the United Keetoowah Band are in Oklahoma. These are not historical footnotes. They are living nations, and what is being described here is their record. The record says this: when the ancestors of the Cherokee came into these mountains, the country was not empty. Another people were already there, and had been for a long time. Their structures were already standing, already old. Walls no one had watched being built stood on the ridgelines. That people were different. The accounts describe them as small in stature, they describe them as pale-skinned, and in some collections they are described as bearded, and one detail overrides all the others. They could not see during the day. Sunlight blinded them, so they moved at night, worked at night, and carried at night. The Cherokee gave them a name for it, and Barton put that name into English in 1797, the Moon-Eyed People. The rest of the account says the two peoples did not stay side by side. There was a conflict, and the Moon-Eyed People were driven out of the region. Some versions add that the expulsion came during a full moon, not the night a people fleeing the sun is weakest, but the night they are most visible. This account is not tied to one valley either. The same core surfaces in versions collected across Cherokee country, from northern Georgia to western North Carolina, and more importantly, the record survived 1838. Removal cut the nation in two. One part stayed in the mountains, the larger part was marched 800 miles west. A rupture like that scatters a community's memory. This account did not scatter. Now picture what the transmission looked like: an elder by a fire, a grandchild across from him, and what is being handed over is not a fairy tale, but a description of a boundary. This is our country. It belonged to someone else before us, and what they left is still standing on the ridges. The child memorizes it. Years later, he says the same lines to his own grandchild. At one end of that chain is a book printed in Philadelphia in 1797, and there is something inside the account that most retellings walk straight past. Peoples generally claim the impressive structures standing on their own ground because an oral tradition exists in large part to say what the ancestors built. This one does not. The Cherokee tradition does the opposite here. It says these walls are not ours, and it hands the authorship of its country's most visible monument to somebody else, inside its own account. That is not a story a community invents in its own favor. And note what is missing from it. There is no whales in this account, no prince, no ship, nobody crossing the Atlantic, not one European element anywhere in it. All of that was added much later by other people. The Cherokee record never needed a Welsh prince. Now to the arithmetic of the stone, because the numbers make a problem of their own, independent of any account. The wall runs 885 feet, and early records say it once stood considerably higher than it does now. Even on a conservative estimate, the stone inside that structure comes to hundreds of tons, and counted as individual pieces, tens of thousands of stones. Every one by hand. There were no draft animals in North America before contact. No horses, no oxen, no wheels. Every stone that reached the top of a 2,800-foot ridge got there on human muscle. No water up there, no fields, no settlement, which means everyone who worked on it worked at the summit, lived below it, and walked that climb again and again, stone by stone. Labor at that scale requires organization. Organization requires continuity. Continuity requires a population. So where is the population? When a structure of that scale holds people, it leaves garbage behind. Broken pottery, hearth ash, animal bone, stone flakes. That is how archaeology reads a place. People are clearest in what they threw away. There is no such accumulation on the summit of Fort Mountain. The 29 pits counted along the wall have not been explained either. Fire pits, storage, lookout positions, part of a ceremonial layout, none of it has been demonstrated, and the same goes for the gateway-like gaps set at intervals along its length. The structure does not let its function be read off its own shape. People came, hauled hundreds of tons of stone uphill, built something, and left behind not even the residue of a meal. And Fort Mountain is not alone. Similar stone walls and enclosures crown other summits across the southeast. Alex Mountain in Georgia, Old Stone Fort in Tennessee, and structures along the Appalachian ridges that are mostly unmeasured, mostly unexcavated, and none of them firmly dated. What they share is this: all of them are high, none of them is well sited for defense, and all of them were built by hands that left no written record, not one name. One mountaintop can be an anomaly, a dozen mountaintops are a pattern, and the pattern carries no author. None of them bears an inscription, none of them sits above a burial that settles the question, none of them stands beside a settlement that identifies it. Stone is exactly as silent as stone is always allowed to be. And then there is an object. In the 1800s, in the town of Murphy, North Carolina, deep in old Cherokee country, a carved soapstone statue was reportedly unearthed. It shows two figures side by side, joined together, with rounded faces and disproportionately large eyes. Today it sits in the County Historical Museum. Archaeologists cannot say with certainty who carved it, when, or what it represents. Local tradition has long attached it to one thing, and one thing only: the Moon-Eyed People. On its own, that proves nothing. But it sits there still, a physical object attached by memory alone to a people nobody can identify. Now put the two lines side by side. The first line is paper. A book printed in Philadelphia in 1797. A governor's letter written in 1810. An ethnographic compilation published in a federal agency's annual report in 1900. 3 records, 3 separate authors, none of them working from the others. All of them predate archaeology. When Barton wrote, not a single measurement had been taken of the stone structures on Georgia's summits, there was no wall under debate, and there was no theory that needed defending. The record said, the people here came before us, they were different, and they left. The second line is stone, 885 feet of mortarless masonry, 29 pits, material that cannot be dated directly, and a range pulled from regional comparison that runs from 1500 to 2000 years ago. For a comparable structure in Tennessee, radiocarbon gave AD 30 to 430. If that dating holds, the wall stood there before the historic Cherokee presence. Now read the two sentences back to back. Cherokee tradition says, "When our ancestors arrived, this thing was already old." Archaeology says this thing was most likely built before the Cherokee presence in the region. Those two sentences never heard each other. One was carried on a mountain, beside a fire, across generations. The other was produced in a radiocarbon laboratory 2,000 years later, in an entirely different language, by people with no interest in confirming anything the first one said. And they say the same thing. This is where care is required. This is not proof. This is a convergence. An oral tradition pointing the same direction as a dating range does not validate that tradition. It does make it much harder to shelve as folklore. When two independent record systems describe the same gap, the gap does not get bigger, it gets sharper. The wall is real, and it has been measured. The records are real. They were printed, they carry dates, and they sit in libraries. The dating range is real, contested, but real. The unanswered part begins only after that point. When Barton wrote that sentence in 1797, he did not know what he was recording. He was writing down what a people said about the largest monument in their own country, and nothing more than that. And now we reach the place where the story was taken. When early American settlers heard this account, they already had an explanation waiting. A legend had been circulating since the 16th century, that in 1170, a Welsh prince named Madoc sailed west, made land 3 centuries before Columbus, moved inland, built stone fortifications, and watched his descendants disappear into the continent. So when they heard of a pale, bearded, fort-building people who were driven out, the connection looked irresistible. Sevier made it explicitly. In his telling, Oconostota says the fort builders were called Welsh, and that they had crossed the Great Water. So what is actually there? The Madoc story first appears in writing in the 16th century, at a moment when England had a powerful political motive to claim a British presence in America ahead of Spain. No Welsh record from Madoc's own era describes the voyage. No artifact recovered anywhere in North America has ever been verified as medieval Welsh. Claims of Welsh-speaking tribes were chased repeatedly through the 18th and 19th centuries and evaporated on contact every single time. And modern archaeology has found no European material culture in the southeast, predating the Spanish expeditions of the 1500s. On Madoc, the scholarly verdict is about as close to settled as these things get. It is a legend, not history. The same honesty has to be applied to the other side. Accounts written down by outsiders pass through the filter of whoever is holding the pen. Sevier had his own enthusiasms, and 19th century collectors sometimes blended Cherokee accounts with the European legends they wanted to believe. And the strongest explanation is also the most ordinary-looking one. Indigenous communities of the Woodland period, peoples who raised ceremonial structures, walled the summits, and whose names were forgotten long before their work fell down. On that reading, the Moon-eyed account may preserve a real cultural memory, the memory that someone else was here first, dressed over generations in mythic detail. Some researchers propose a simpler seed for the strangest detail of all, individuals or families with albinism, whose pale skin and severe sensitivity to sunlight match the description of people who could not bear the day. Nothing is proven. Each explanation covers part of the account. None of them covers all of it. But this much holds. Removing Madoc from the equation does not remove the mystery. It returns the mystery to its owner. Look at the scorecard as it stands. In more than 200 years of searching, the Madoc theory has produced not one verified artifact. The claim that the stone structures predate the Cherokee is the position modern archaeology broadly supports. The tradition has aged better than the theory that tried to replace it. If you value documentaries that follow records like these, original documents, archaeology, and indigenous accounts, subscribe and leave what you make of the Moon-eyed people in the comments, because that is what keeps investigations like this one coming. Fort Mountain offers no answer. The wall has been mapped, measured, photographed, and walked by generations. The stones stay exactly as uninformative as stacked stones always are. Whoever set them there left no inscription, no burial that settles the question, and no name. Only the Cherokee left a name. When Barton put that name on paper in 1797, he did not think he was writing down a mystery. He was writing down what a people remembered. So who do you believe the Cherokee were remembering?